Ladies and gentlemen, my work has always lived at the intersection of pain and possibility, asking questions not to provoke, but to transform. Tonight, I invite you to walk with me through a story that begins in darkness, descends into hate, and rises haltingly toward repair. Our guest once stood in stark opposition to everything that I hold sacred. But the man beside me now is no longer that man. Jeff Schoep was once the most prominent neo-Nazi leader in the United States. For over 2 decades, he led the National Socialist movement, spreading division, enshrining hate, and targeting people like me, like you. And then he walked away. He let go of the ideology, of the identity and the power that he once clung to, because he came face to face with the humanity of those he tried to erase, and perhaps more painfully, with his own. Since 2019, through the organisation he founded, Beyond Barriers, and together with his partnership with the Simon Wiesenthal Centre, Jeff has worked tirelessly to demolish the very machinery he once helped build. He now supports extremist disengagement, de-radicalises youth, as well as works with governments and intelligence agencies worldwide to combat online hate. This is not a story of forgetting. This is a story of moral reckoning, of standing in the wreckage of one's past and choosing to shape a future rooted in courage and conviction. And now, with that considerable preamble, Jeff, welcome.
Thank you.
This isn't a space for pleasantries, it's a space for truth, the kind that wounds and heals. Long before tonight, you and I learned to sit in that fire. When I invited you some 3 years ago now to be a guest on my podcast, Brave Journeys, I was absolutely terrified. As a Jewish woman, both the daughter and granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, and please don't do the sums in your head, standing beside a man who once proudly marched beneath swastikas and chanted 6 million more, felt unthinkable, unforgivable, unconscionable. But silence is its own kind of complicity, and there was a question that would not silence. So I asked, and you answered, and what I found wasn't the man that I feared. I found a man standing in the ashes of his former life doing the brutal, unglamorous work of atonement. Since then, I've watched you walk back into that fire, not to erase it, never to excuse it, but to dismantle it. And tonight I sit beside you without any fear, because the humanity you have fought so hard to reclaim is real and it shows. And that is why tonight matters, ladies and gentlemen. Because it's not only your story, Jeff, it's a warning flare in the darkness, a siren in an age where anti-Semitism is again rampant. We just had to see what happened today. When Jews are spat on in our streets, vilified in our institutions, intimidated on campus, and worse than that, beaten in our cities, hunted in the nations that swore never again. So it was the unflinching endorsement of the Simon Wiesenthal Centre, and particularly Rabbi Abraham Cooper, that told me that this conversation wasn't just permissible, it was imperative. So let's begin. Jeff, what is striking, almost disorienting about you is that you didn't come from chaos. Your life was not replete with rupture and hardship. You came from a loving home, middle-class Minnesota. There's no early trauma or visible rupture, and yet somehow you find your way to Nazism. What pulls a teenager without any clear grievance into that kind of world, and what makes that ideology, that vile ideology, magnetic?
There's many things that attract people to these extremist ideologies. For some people, it's a sense of belonging. For others, it's the ideology. It can be, there's many different entry points. For me, my grandfather fought in the German army during World War II. My great uncles fought as well. I'm first generation American. My mother, my grandparents, they had come over from Germany after the war. They were from Prussia originally, and I grew up and I knew my grandfather had fought in the war since I was in the 4th grade. And he was a strong figure in our family, somebody I looked up to. And I also knew that the family lost their homes and land and everything in Prussia. So I felt a sense of grievance, I guess you could say. I felt that my family something was taken from them. And I wanted to grow up and be like my grandfather. And he wasn't encouraging me to be a Nazi or anything like that. I wasn't raised that way. I wasn't taught to hate. I wasn't taught racism in the home. None of that. In fact, just the opposite. Yet I knew that history, and I became like obsessed with it. So I'm reading everything I can get my hands on World War II, and wasn't taught to be a racist or an anti-Semite until after I joined the movement, which I sought that movement out, and I joined at the age of 18 and quickly rose up through the ranks. And then quickly became the propagandist and the person that was teaching the hate.
I think it's really poignant that you say, despite the family mythology and the history, this was not a world in which you lived in. You were not raised a racist. But at 19, you joined the movement. By 21, you're its commander. What did that role demand of you, and what did it give you?
The role demanded everything. Your life meant nothing, the cause meant everything. That is how I viewed it. That's how a lot of the people that were involved in that, in any kind of extremist movement, same with groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. When you're part of it, the cause means everything. Everything else is less than that. So my family had tried everything that they could to get me out of that movement. My father was going to send me to his sister's family farm in rural Iowa. I remember the family farm. I'd been out there before as a kid, and I remember there was 2 TV channels out there. It was church and church. So as a young man growing up as a teenager, that was a very scary thought for me. I didn't want to go be sent to rural Iowa. That was even more rural than where I grew up, So they tried everything. My grandfather tried to approach me, and after I'd been involved for some time, and he had said, the path that you are on, Jeff, is going to lead to one of 2 places, prison or death. And I said, and I was very disrespectful at this point. I'd never been disrespectful to him before. But I said, Opa, you might have surrendered. You might have given up, but I will keep fighting. I don't care if they kill me. I don't care if they throw me in prison. I will never stop fighting. I will always stand up for my people, and I will keep fighting. So that's the mindset, is the people that are involved in these organizations. I don't say that to excuse it, because there is no excuse for it. I take full ownership of the mistakes that I made with my life. But the mindset is that they're doing something good and noble and honorable. So I'm of this mindset that I'm not doing these evil things. Looking at it from the outside, looking in, and seeing it how I see it now, it's truly evil, it's truly wrong. I make no excuses for that. There is no excuse, it's unexcusable. There is no excuse. But in the mindset of the radicalized individual, they're doing what's honorable and good. So I'm thinking, I'm a patriot, I'm fighting for my country, I'm fighting for my people, I'm defending my race. That's the mindset that I had. And I explain that not to seek sympathy or to make excuses about it, but so others can understand the psychological mindset of it, because that matters. If we're trying to reach people and trying to shape hearts and minds, it's really important.
I want to ask you this because of your relatively warm, loving upbringing. And this is something that I've had a difficult time to wrap my head around. For you specifically, was it about ideology, or was it about something more primal, like a longing to belong, to be part of something bigger?
It's tough to say, because I saw a lot of people that needed that sense of belonging, so it could have been anything for them. For me, I sought out this ideology. It was something that I wanted to be a part of, that I wanted to serve in ever since I could remember. When I was a young kid, I thought it was something noble and good, so I sought it out. And I think it's important to say what hate does. We all know what hate does to society. We know that it's wrong. A lot of people don't realize what hate does to the people that are surrounded by it. It destroyed so many aspects of my life, but not just my life, but it destroyed aspects of my family's life that had nothing to do with it, that totally denounced what I was a part of. my mother's career was destroyed by what I was involved in. My father was in manufacturing. I grew up as you mentioned, in rural Minnesota, in a good home. My mother was an attorney. Her dream was to be a judge in the state of Minnesota. She was elected to be a judge. So it was time for her to take her seat on the bench, and there was one last formality where the governor of the state had to sign off on all the new judges. And the way she explained this to me at the time was she got a phone call from the governor, and the governor said, "Mr. Schoep, your father fought in the German army during World War II. Your son's a leader in the neo-Nazi movement. I do not feel you are fit to be a judge in this state." So my involvement in this garbage destroyed my mother's career. That's something that is unforgivable. That's a guilt and shame that I have to carry with me for the rest of my life.
By the mid-2010s, you're meeting people that you had historically dehumanized. You're meeting black musicians, you're meeting Muslim filmmakers, you're meeting Holocaust survivors, and they meet you not with vengeance, but with grace. You agree to appear. I should disclose to the audience, in a former life, I used to be a documentary filmmaker, and this is actually why I approached Jeff in the first place to be a guest on my show. You appear in Dia Khan's Emmy Award-winning documentary film. Dia is a moderate Muslim filmmaker, and she did a film called White Right, Meeting the Enemy. And I had to ask you this, and I've got to ask you this again. What compels a person who is completely immersed in Nazi ideology to have said yes to an invitation like that?
So that's a question I get quite a bit, and the answer is simple. It was an opportunity. Every documentary that I had appeared in was an opportunity to spread the propaganda of the movement. So it didn't really matter who the host was or anything like that. So the only group, or only person I should say I wouldn't agree to talk with was Jerry Springer. And I don't know if you guys have that. Yeah, Jerry was really a clown show, so I was like, no, I'm not going to do that. But just about everything else. Standards, right, yeah. Even neo-Nazi had a standard. It was a bit much. But yeah, so I would agree to be in all these different films to spread that propaganda. But what I didn't expect or anticipate, and it totally changed my life, was seeing the humanity in the people that I had once vilified. So I had originally told Dia Khan, I said, you got 30 minutes of my time when I come out for this interview, and that's it. 4 hours later, Dia's looking at her watch, said, what happened to that 30 minutes, Jeff? I said, I don't know. The questions you're asking are interesting. She did not tell me that I was wrong, she showed me how I was wrong. And that made a difference. So my family, everybody that was trying to reach me over all those years, no one could get through. When I met Daryl Davis and I met Dia Khan, how I could see how they shared how hate affected them as children growing up and what that had done to them in their lives, and telling me deeply personal stories, which I don't know if we have time, but I can explain some of that.
I'd love to hear that, but I just have to pause because I don't think many people in the audience would have had the benefit of seeing this documentary. And there is this just one seminal, life-altering moment, and if you are a filmmaker, you know that if you've captured something transformative on celluloid, it changes everything. You know that you are going to transport the audience to a place they've never been before. And Dia asks you, and please forgive me because I'm going to use an expletive which I would never ordinarily ever do in a shul or in an adjacent hall to a shul, but you forgive me, it's contextual. So Dia asks you with staggering poise whether you would have called her shit-skinned, which is a slur that you necessarily would have applied to her. And you just watch you break in that moment. Something shatters, and she's no longer the other, she's no longer a symbol, and your ideology can't survive her humanity. What was that for you?
Well, you explain that better than I do.
But you've looked back on this.
Yeah.
And you had people in the movement that started questioning you at that juncture.
Yes.
Calling you weak.
Yeah, well, they didn't say the word weak, but they said she made me look soft. Soft. Yeah, well, that's kind of weak too. But yeah, she got to me. She really got to me. And I'd gotten to know Dia over the course of the filming because she had traveled across the country with us and spent a good amount of time with her. And when she was referring to that in the film and saying that word, it bothered me. And then she's like, "What? You don't like that?" And I said, I "Don't refer to yourself like that. I don't like that." And the cameraman zoomed in on my eyes, so that was a big moment, and people could see it. And basically, when she said, the ideology that I stand for, the things that I believe in, made her feel less than, ugly, not worthy, not less than human, something of that nature. That's when I felt like it felt like getting kicked in the chest by a horse. It hurt. It really hurt. I could feel her pain. I could see it in her face. I felt it like a vibe, like an energy in the air, and that shifted things like you couldn't believe. Right? That didn't leave immediately, like the snap of a fingers, and most people don't. I can count hundreds of people that I've helped leave and that I know that have left. I can count maybe on one hand the people that left over like one act of kindness, maybe a few more than that. But it usually takes time. It's a process, because if you have this deeply seated belief system, especially as long as I was involved, you have to dismantle that. You have to unwork that. So typically in the process,
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but that's the only adult self you ever knew. You were in the movement for 25 years and you joined it at 18, 19. So how do you get your head around even trying to undo that fixed thinking?
For me, it was a backwards process. Usually you want to disengage from, like if you're working on somebody that you're trying to change their hearts and minds, you want them to disengage, and then you work on de-radicalization. You get them away from the group. My process was backwards. I'm de-radicalizing while I'm still in. Now, if somebody would have said that to me, those would have been fighting words. I would have said, "You don't know what you're talking about. That's crazy talk. You don't know what you're talking about." But looking back on it and analyzing that now, psychologically, I was most definitely de-radicalizing while I was still in. The last few years that I was involved in the movement, I'm calling it a white civil rights group. I'm demanding to the press, every time I talk to the press, stop calling us a Nazi group. We're white civil rights, which sounds completely insane and crazy. I realize that, but at the time, that's what made sense to me. It's like, I'm gonna fix this. This is not a hate group, and I was trying to convince myself and the world that it wasn't. And of course it is. It's like I was putting lipstick on a pig. You can dress up the Nazi party, but lipstick on it is still a pig, and that's what I was doing. I look back on it and I can see that as clear as day now. But when you're immersed in it, when you're part of the cult, when you're part of that extremism, you don't see it. So that was my way of trying to fix things. And again, it's not an excuse, but that's the way I was trying to make sense of it in my mind.
In 2019, on the anniversary of Charlottesville, you make your break. That moment isn't random. 2 years earlier, in August 2017, white supremacists storm the streets of Charlottesville chanting, "Jews will not replace us." They carry torches, they carry swastikas, they march with impunity, and it tragically ends in the murder of a woman named Heather Heyer when a white supremacist ploughed his car into a crowd, killing her. And the world recoils, but for you it cuts deeper. I think it held up a mirror to you, to the hate that you led, and to the human being at that juncture you were, and what you represented, and the hate that you helped shape. And on that anniversary, you choose to walk away and to walk toward something else. Jeff, I want you to help us grasp the full weight of that rupture, not just the public collapse, but the private reckoning.
That's a deep question. Ooh. What was it like? It was the hardest thing I ever did in my life. It was so difficult. It was the right thing to do. So I had no regrets about that. I wanted to leave for some time, but I hadn't been able to. I guess you could say, I still don't like the word fear, but I guess you could say I had some fears of what was life like outside of the movement. That's all I knew. I was at war with the world, with the government, with all the other races, with other groups, you name it. I was at war with the world for my entire adult life. I didn't know nothing else but the movement. So there was that. My career was involved in the movement. I ran a record label that's how I made a living. That's what I did for work. So this business that I had built up was involved in it too. And again, not excuses, but these were the things that were going through my head. like, will the world ever see you as anybody else but this neo-Nazi leader that highly well-known and all this sort of thing? Is that all you'll ever be? You know, will the world accept you? And I thought, how? No one's ever done, and I was the most high-profile neo-Nazi to ever leave in the United States. So there was no precedent for this. There was other former extremists that had left and that had made it out, but none of them were high-profile like that. None. So there was nobody you could say, well, this guy made it out. It was sort of like, well, roll the dice and see what happens, you know. So there wasn't anybody I could talk to. There was no support. My support network was my father, Dia, Acacia, one or two other people. There was no more than 5 people, 4 or 5 people. That was it. Because you can't tell people in the movement, hey, I'm thinking about making this change. They're gonna want to pull you back in. So that was, I guess you could say, a fear that I had. Is like, what am I gonna do with my life? So I wanted to. When I realized that this was not something that I should be involved in, this is not good for society, this is not good for anybody, I thought, what can I do to fix this? And I felt like the best thing I can do is be a peace builder. You know, use the skill set that I used for the wrong thing for all those years to try to fix things. Basically, teshuvah, repentance. That's what I wanted to do, and I didn't know what that looked like until I met the Simon Wiesenthal Center.
So how did the first threads of Beyond Barriers start to form?
So Beyond Barriers, we started in 2020. 2020 was a really volatile year. You had a lot of rioting and things going on in the country around that period of time after the George Floyd death, and there was a lot of people that after I had left in 2019, when I left the movement, that were reaching out to me. Some were, of course, threats and all the usual stuff, but others were questioning it. Like, how do you get out? Like, are you a communist now? That was like one of the most common questions. And I'm like, what am I saying that's making people think I'm a communist? Well, when you're in this extreme movement, you don't see the gray areas in life. You see extremes, the far left and the far right. So I thought like that too at the time. After I got out and people are asking me that, I'm thinking, why are they saying that? So I started engaging with them, because if you talk with first of all, if they're reaching out to somebody that just left and denounced the movement, they're curious, and that means a door is open. That means they're thinking, maybe I can change too. So after I left, all these people were leaving with me. A lot more people than I expected had left with me when I left. And then in the next year or so, even more were coming, and I was being inundated with messages from people seeking help to leave or being curious about leaving. I couldn't keep up with it. So I formed the nonprofit, Beyond Barriers, and with Daryl Davis, the African-American musician that helped get people out of these movements. He's probably one of the best in the world at it. He's gotten over 200 people out of the Ku Klux Klan. So he's my brother from another mother. Daryl and I do a lot of this work together, a few other formers and a few other like mental health professionals and people like that. And we put together this organization so people wouldn't have to go through that same struggle that I went through, that they would have some sort of support. So I think that's a noble endeavor, and that was important, but it's more important to me, like when I speak at schools and reach young people, because if people don't ever radicalize in the first place, they don't have to worry about contacting groups like Beyond Barriers. And we don't have to worry about them hurting anybody else or doing anything like that. So education is the key.
Of course, and that's something I want to dive into in a moment. But I just wanted to ask you, you said it almost nonchalantly, it's just incredible that you think that you have, because you bore witness and because you reached back, you have helped hundreds of people de-radicalise. How do you know when somebody is ready for such a metamorphosis? Because they're not always, from conversations you and I have had, they're not always reaching out to you so overtly and saying, I want to get out of here. It's often the opposite, but you know that they're engaging because they're desperate for you to sort of see them.
Yeah, a lot of it is knowing that world and knowing the psychology of it. It's almost non-existent that someone from that world will reach out and say, look, I really need help. Yeah. And we get that once in a while. but that's like the small minority, and it always surprises me because like in that world, you didn't show emotion, you didn't show, emotion was weakness. And that's something that was just natural in that environment. Like you did not show emotion because that was a survival mechanism. And that's something that I didn't even recognize until after I got out and was processing all these things in what I call the decompression period, where your mind is just going through all of this, like, what did I do? What can I do to fix this? All these things. And my daughter's mother had said to me, she says, after my mother had passed away, and my daughters had said, Dad has feelings, or Dad has emotions. It was something along those lines. And I was like, what the heck is that supposed to mean? Why are they saying that? And she's like, it's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing. Think about it. And I really had to process that. Like, even though I wasn't propagandizing my kids at home, they knew who I was. They suffered because of what I was involved in too. The little town that we lived in rural Minnesota, the senior class, it was either the junior or senior class, every year talked about the neo-Nazi leader that lived in town. My daughters and my kids are in that class. You know, so they had to all go through that except for my youngest. But having to process that even though I thought I sheltered them from a lot of it, it didn't. It wasn't. They weren't sheltered from it. And even though I thought I separated who I was as the commander of the National Socialist Movement and I was Dad at home, I still carried that baggage. So they didn't, all those years, they didn't see like the humanity in their own father. And that, I mean, I don't even know how to articulate what that feels like. It feels awful. It's like they were cheated out of that.
You have become a fierce advocate for something that's almost countercultural in our fractured age, which is called relational dialogue, which is this audacious belief that humans can get together and talk about things and actually break down some of these ideological nonsenses that people hold on to with ferocity. This isn't something that you preach, it's something that you do, like you live this now. Can you explain what it actually really looks like? And what is it about being seen, and I mean really seen, not humiliated, not shamed, not derided, and meeting someone where they're at, that can undo the roots of this abject hatred?
Relational dialogue is another talk altogether though, Tammy. Actually, we just started doing workshops of it in June of this year because people wanted to learn how to do it. And it's something that I've talked about for a few years, but just started teaching it now. It is almost counterintuitive to how we all handle conversations in life. Like when you argue, you know, people raise their voice and they raise their voice back. When I met Daryl Davis, and it's a perfect example of how relational dialogue works, I realized, you know, I'm sitting across from what's supposed to be an adversary. So I pound my fist on the table and I said, you know, Daryl, I'll fight to the last bullet for my people. Daryl didn't react. Typically in those situations, the other side would get angry and then it escalates, right? He didn't do that. He just says, okay. And then continued the conversation. Like I didn't even raise my voice or get aggressive or anything. So now I'm like, what is going on in this conversation? I'm trying to figure him out. And then he's sharing something deeply personal about himself, about how racism and hate affected him as a child. And that diffused everything, because now I saw the humanity in the person that I'm sitting across from. So with relational dialogue, it's almost counterintuitive to how a lot of us react, especially in arguments or with somebody that we feel is the enemy or somebody we disagree with. But it's finding commonalities and being able to connect with them on those levels and not... active listening is important. Respect is huge. Everybody wants to be loved. Everybody wants to be seen. Everybody wants to be heard. These are natural human aspects of how people react. And if you grant somebody that, you have a chance to change their hearts and minds.
It's amazing. And, you know, the world seems so broken, like so broken. So I just wanted to know, how do we make dialogue not just permissible or likely? How do we make it irresistible when there is just so much cacophonous noise and there's just so much hatred that seems to be swirling around? Where's the entry point?
You're not gonna unfortunately, there's no one-all fix-all. You know, we can't say like everybody's going to be fixed by this and it's going to happen really fast. But if we can find those commonalities in a conversation, like I don't suggest people go up to like say a Nazi rally or a pro-Hamas, pro-Palestinian rally and go try to have a conversation there, because it's not going to work. It's peer pressure. You got all the people around you. But if you can sit down with people in a one-on-one situation and have a conversation, first don't start with the things that divide us, but start with some things that are in common, like icebreakers, or talk about other things, whether it's family or things like that, or things that one has gone through. And then see the humanity in the person that you're sitting across from. It also has to do with like not rolling your eyes or not going, you know, or body language. That's a key to it as well. So if you're doing that with somebody, you've lost them already. You know, even if you know they're saying these ridiculous, crazy things. An example I use on that, and I'll just say this real quick, was there's a conspiracy theory group called QAnon, all right? And this is a great example because it's so wacko. But they had a conspiracy theory going on back in like 2016 or something, that JFK was gonna come back from the dead and help President Trump. And you wanna say, oh my gosh, like, how could anybody believe this? It doesn't make sense. Everybody knows JFK was killed. How is this going to happen? You know, so instead of, you know, laughing at that person that's saying that, or making fun of them, or saying they're ridiculous or something like that, you might go like this. That's a really interesting viewpoint you have there. Could you tell me how is that going to work? Didn't JFK die? Or ask questions, because they want to be seen and heard, right? So they're going to tell you how they came to this conclusion, and you're probably not going to flip them at that point. Nobody in an argument is going to say, "Oh gosh, you win." Nobody does that, you know. But if you plant those seeds, because that's how Dia Khan approached me. We were talking about politics in Detroit, and we're talking about how the economy was destroyed and how all this economic decline. And she says, "Jeff, well, what you're saying makes a lot of sense, but why are you just speaking for white people? And oh, by the way, not all white people agree with you, so just some white people. So why do you just speak some white people? Because this doesn't affect everybody here in Detroit, not just some white people." And I remember when she said that, I spewed out some movement nonsense at the time, but I couldn't sleep that night because it was going around in my head like a hamster wheel. Why couldn't you answer that lady? Why couldn't you answer that lady? You're supposed to be commander of the NSM. You're supposed to have all the answers. Why couldn't you answer her? I couldn't answer her because I was wrong. And it took a minute. But that's how you can start to change hearts and minds.
Very frighteningly, YouTube now hosts the highest volume of extremist and neo-Nazi content on the planet. And worse, these algorithms don't just reflect hate, they recruit. They're luring children before they even know what they're looking at into echo chambers of rage and counterfeit belonging. Jeff, you've worked with law enforcement and governments tracing how extremism metastasizes online. What must we urgently understand about how radicalization unfolds in the digital age?
I think the most important thing is to educate young people and inoculate them against hate and disinformation and misinformation. Algorithms are going to drive people into echo chambers. We're seeing it constantly. We're seeing it on adult levels, not just youth, but youth are even more susceptible to it because their brains are still forming. They're still trying to form their opinions, and they're going into some very dark places. The algorithms are driving that.
But I'm so sorry to interrupt.
No.
That's what I want to distill from you. How do we go from algorithmic drift to ideological capture to real world violence? Like, what does that actually look like?
It's a short step. It's a short step from becoming radicalized, and this is where we're seeing some of the worst of the extremists are typically not people that are active in like these active organizations that we're seeing out on the streets, but lone wolf types that are being radicalized on their own, that don't have any sort of system in place. Like the organization that I was in, there was strict rules and regulations and things like that. So if someone broke the chain of command, they would be punished, or they'd be thrown out, or they'd have all these consequences. Someone that's being radicalized online on their own, the shift to violence can become as quick as a snap of a finger because they think they're going to do something good and noble. They're going to throw their life away to take away others. And that can happen very easily, unfortunately. And the more unstable the individual is, the higher chance.
So disturbing. Only weeks ago, we know what happened today, ladies and gentlemen, but only weeks ago, neo-Nazis marched in Melbourne, saying that Melbourne has now become the neo-Nazi capital of Australia. And they left the scene without arrest, which is something we've been used to for the last 23 months. Today their chants started again. Jeff, this isn't abstract, it's not history, we are living through this. The headlines tonight describe this chilling fusion of xenophobia and neo-Nazism, and it's really not extremism whispering in the shadows. This is happening, not in far-flung places, this is happening on the streets of our city every single weekend. ASIO has now warned of a more complex, more degraded, more dangerous security landscape. So with your expertise, I want to ask you, where do far left and far right ideologies truly converge? And which is the greater threat to Jews?
Ooh. We've done a talk with the Simon Wiesenthal Center. We call it the intersections of hate, and this is specifically where we are bringing together the anti-Semitism. We're discussing the anti-Semitism of the far right and the anti-Semitism we're seeing on the far left. These are ultimately, they boil down to the same hatred in the end. Which is worse? I hate to play that game because people don't like the answer. They'll say, well, one is worse than the other. They're both incredibly bad. So I don't know if it's fair to say which is worse, but for me, I think what we're seeing with the far left, and this could be stereotypical because they'll say, okay, well, you came from the right, so of course you're going to demonize the left. So take this with a grain of salt. But what we're seeing from the far left is they've radicalized youth in our institutions. And it's the long march through the institutions. They've brought this stuff. They've got college professors that are teaching this stuff. The far right, I can't think of any neo-Nazi professors that I know of anywhere, but they are far left, radical, communist and socialist professors that are in universities all over the country. I can't speak about Australia too much as far as that's concerned, but I'm assuming it's the same. In the United States, it's that way. So that long march through the institutions is incredibly dangerous because you are radicalizing a whole generation of young people that are coming up and that are being taught to hate. And that's why we're seeing these uprisings on campuses all across the country. And I have talked with families all across the United States, one after another. Well, a mother will come up and say, my son was attacked at the University of Chicago for wearing a kippah. He was hit in the back of the head with a rock and he was assaulted. And my daughter was attacked here. And you just hear it over and over and over again. And that's not the far right doing that. And again, that doesn't excuse the neo-Nazism that's on our streets because that has to be confronted as well. But I think it's incredibly concerning that our college campuses have become breeding grounds for hate.
You here in Melbourne for the last week with your gorgeous Acacia, right? You're staying in the city. You were on the streets today.
Yep.
Give us a sense of what it feels like when you're no longer part of that world. What were your observations?
It was the first, since I left the movement in early 2019, when there's been these rallies and things like that, I've kind of steered clear of them, but we wanted to go down and see what it was like, what was going on there. So it was a little weird for me in that sense, like not being in the mix, so to speak, not being somebody that was out there instigating or causing trouble, but observing instead. And I can tell you, seeing the, on one side, I saw a sea of Australian flags, and I think this is a problem, because that's not a problem. The problem is that they allowed Nazis to speak at the rallies. So what, from their perspective, from that side of things, I think that hurts the message of the nationalists if they're allowing Nazis to get up there and speak. That's a problem. Now, on the other side of it, I saw more people in keffiyehs than I'd ever seen at any point, anywhere, other than when I've been in the Middle East. But in the West, seeing that many keffiyehs, and it wasn't Muslims. I mean, of course you had some of that too, but it was middle-aged white women and men and just people of all different ages out there wearing these keffiyehs and carrying signs like "Death to the IDF" and things of that nature from the left, and that was quite disturbing for me, and that's something that I think is new. I know it's new because I hadn't seen that in the United States. Now we're seeing it in the United States. Before October 7th, we didn't see that. No. So that's a big problem now, and so I just, my heart breaks for the Jewish community. I can't imagine being someone Jewish being out there caught between that madness. It's just, it's devastating.
In 2021, you enter a shul in Skokie, Illinois, a place that's seared into Jewish memory. 4 decades earlier, Holocaust survivors stood their ground there as neo-Nazis marched through their streets, and Skokie became a symbol of Holocaust survivors' defiance. And yet you enter that sacred place, not to incite, but to repent. Jeff, what does that moment feel like, to stand before the very community your former self once tried to disappear and not be met with fury, but with radical kindness and with a mercy that you hadn't yet earned?
It was life-altering. Going to that synagogue, I was quite nervous. I thought, you know, if the shoe was on the other foot, I would probably want to stone me to death or something, you know, like I did not expect any sort of kindness or anything. In fact, I even asked the Midwest director of the Wiesenthal Center, I said, do you think I should even say anything about my family connection? Because I knew there was going to be Holocaust survivors and their families there. And she says, oh, absolutely, you need to be transparent and share that. And I thought, oh gosh, I was hoping to get out of that part of it, you know, but I tell you what, I received more hugs in that synagogue than I think I'd ever gotten anywhere in my life up until that point before that. And the rabbi was so kind and gracious. There was several of us there that were former neo-Nazis, and it was life-altering. It truly was. It's one of the highlights, I think, of getting to know the Jewish community, because it was life-changing.
So my final question to you this evening, from that place of bearing witness to your own harm, what would you say to Jewish people like me who carry the intergenerational weight of trauma and who wrestle still with the enormity of your transformation?
That is a really hard question. You saved the hardest question for last. I don't feel like I have the right to ask for anybody for forgiveness or anything like that. Of course, we all want that, you know, everybody wants that in life, but I don't feel like I have the right to ask for that or to expect that. And I understand that some people can't get beyond that, you know, and it's less and less as the time that goes by. But I know when I first left the movement, a lot of people didn't believe me, and that was devastating. On a personal level, like I felt like, wow, I'm risking my life speaking out against this movement. I'm viewed as a traitor by the people that I'd, you know, served with all those years, and I'm speaking out against this and putting my life on the line, and people don't believe me. Like I just felt like, well, maybe I should just go back into business, not in that world, but stop talking about this stuff and just go live my life somewhere, you know, and not ever speak about this again. My conscience wouldn't allow that. So I'll keep speaking out, and I don't care if somebody doesn't believe me. That's their problem, not mine. I can't control what anybody else feels or thinks. All I can do is try to do what's right and engage in tikkun olam.
Jeff, I will never excuse the man you once were, and I don't think history asks us to do that. But I will never turn away from the man that you have fought so hard to become. nor from what it truly costs to rebuild a life from its rubble. To each of you here tonight, may we leave not soothed, but stirred. Awake to what was, alert to what still is, and unshakable in what must never take root again. Because the antidote to hate isn't silence, it's memory, it's truth, it's accountability, and above all, it's hope. Not passive hope, not performative hope, but radical, sleeves rolled up, defiant hope. And surely we can agree that the world is crying out for that hope right about now. So I really want to thank you, each and every one of you, for showing up. It's not easy. Thank you for listening. Thank you for leaning in, for choosing discomfort over distance. Jeff's journey reminds us that hate can be unlearned, humanity can be reclaimed, and silence is never neutral. Please join me in thanking a man who once marched toward hate, but now walks every day toward healing. We now have a few extra minutes and we really would love to throw it open to Q&A. Please feel free to ask any questions. Please make them questions and not statements if possible, and Rabbi will kindly hand around the mic.
Thank you. If you don't mind, if I could ask the first question. Well, I've got a number of questions, but I'll be fair to everyone else. So we saw these neo-Nazis marching in the streets a couple of weeks ago, and it's been on and off. I'm just curious, the meetings that will be held, from these groups, I'm assuming would not be too dissimilar to the meetings you were having once upon a time. The actual threat, like what plans would you think these guys have to actually commit? Is it just walking in the streets, or are they actually talking about, we're going to come and shoot shuls up? Like, what were you talking about in terms of actually committing acts of violence against communities? So, because a lot of people say, they're just making noise, but are they actually talking about, we want to come and kill Jews or do things like that?
There's a lot of nuance to that question because it depends on the group. So the group that I was involved in was what you call an above ground organization, so they had to operate within the law. That's not to say everybody did. There was people that went rogue and did terrible things, but they had to operate within the law. Nothing new about how these groups are operating. Like the main one, I'm not even going to name them, the group or the leader or anything, but the main one that we're seeing here in Australia is a carbon cookie cutter organization of the organization that I used to run. It looks like they took the blueprint and they're copying it. So some of the same propaganda efforts that they're doing and things like that are very similar. So that's an above ground group. That doesn't mean that couldn't change. And there's other organizations like in the United States, like Aryan Brotherhood or something. Now this is a prison gang. They're doing selling drugs. They're doing illegal activities. The most dangerous ones are accelerationists. So if someone's involved in the accelerationist movement, these are the people that are talking openly about terrorism, about harming people. They're the most radical of the radical. And the main groups that were involved in that, a lot of them have been broken up by the system, which is great. But on the flip side of that, they've spread out. So a lot of these people are being radicalized on their own, and they're glorifying school shooters, they're glorifying mass shooters. People like the guy in New Zealand that did the mass shooting, they're glorifying people like that. And that's incredibly dangerous because when you get someone that's especially mentally ill or has suffering from different mental issues, and that person gets a hold of a gun or a weapon, those are the most dangerous people that are out there. And there's people that are promoting that stuff that aren't doing it, but they're trying to get other people to do that stuff. So that's where the biggest danger, the biggest threat comes from, the extreme far right in that sense, yes.
Thank you very much. Can you tell us how the movement has been funded, and if you're aware, both here and in the States? Who's funding it and by how much?
Most of the funding, like the group I was in, the funding was coming mostly from the membership or from, sometimes you get donations in the mail or things like that, but there wasn't a lot of money coming in, so that's one of the reasons why I formed the record label, was to help fund those type of things, to make your own businesses, and some of the groups will do things like that. So there's not like really, that I'm aware of anyway, like somebody up on top that's got billions of dollars that's funding these groups. I'm sure some of the groups maybe have people like that, but it's tough to say like who exactly that is. A lot of these movements are blue collar, so they're not well funded, but some of them are well funded. It just kind of depends on the group. But I wouldn't know. That kind of thing is kept under tight lid, so nobody in the other groups is saying, hey guys, we're getting funded by this person over here. They're not saying that. So I can only speak from my experience, and in the group that I was in, most of it was coming out of the pockets of the people that supported it.
Hi, I'm curious to know about your own personal safety after having left the organisation.
Yeah, there's a lot of risk of speaking out, I suppose. There is. I've gotten a lot of threats, especially anytime I'm in the press or things like that. Threats will come in, but I don't try to live in fear. I came out of a high-stress, dangerous environment before. So this is just a different kind of high-stress, dangerous environment now. But nobody's going to stop me from speaking the truth and trying to do what's right. So I try not to live in that, because I think if you live in that fear, it can control you, and it can cause you not to. It's the same thing with, I think, anybody. If you live in fear, like, what, if I walk across the street, I'm going to get hit by a bus, so I'm afraid to cross the street now. I think if we live like that, it's hard to move forward. So you just kind of put your life in the hands of God, and what happens is going to happen.
Sound like my late father.
Jeff, we've lived in Australia in probably the golden era for the Jewish people since the migrants came after the Second World War. How concerned should we be when you see what happened in the streets today, as to whether this is a place that Jews are going to be able to settle, and can you put the cat back in the bag?
Well, that's a tough question. I think it goes back to the response on the last question. I think if you allow others to dictate your feeling of safety, then it's not a good place to be mentally. I think you have to stand where you're at, and you can't let anybody else drive you out. You should not let anybody drive you out. I don't know if that's the right answer. That's a really tough question. It's really hard for me to answer that one. But it was really disturbing seeing in the streets today, and you guys are getting hate from a lot of different corners, and it's undeserved. It's not right, and we just got to keep trying to uplift people and do what's right, and show people that it's not what they think it is.
Hi. So I live in Israel, and pretty close after October 7, me and a couple of friends wanted to get on a plane and just go to these stupid, crazy, wacko protests in London and just talk to some of these people thinking they're so naive and they're just hateful and they don't know anything. And last week I wanted to go to this protest today, and my friend found me holding me back, because we want to have these dialogues, and you just believe that if you can just speak to some of these people, they don't even know what they're talking about, and they'll see that I'm a nice person, and they'll see that that's not what they were taught. And that's what we really want to do. And you talk about dialogue, and you also said you can't do it there, so I get that, I accept it. Where can that dialogue happen? Because I'm here and I'm like, I want to go and speak to this person, and the teacher, my nephew's school, he's literally wearing a Palestinian flag in his math class and a gay pride flag, and I just want to talk to the guy. I'm sure if we'd have a dialogue, he'd see something that's not what he thought. Where can those conversations happen that you're talking about?
Definitely not at the rally.
Yeah, accept it.
I do know one guy that he's called the Free Hugs guy, and he goes, and we had done a talk together, and I'm telling the audience, don't go and try to hug a Nazi or anything. And I was like, well, Ken back there, he has done that and it's worked, but that's a very rare case. Usually that does not work. So if you can get somebody like that if you see them in a coffee shop, or even if you approach them and say, hey, I know this isn't the right place, like if it's in school or if it's a teacher or something there, but could we have a conversation? Could we meet for coffee next week or sometime at that point? And that's when you can have that conversation. And the kafia and the gay pride thing right there, I mean, that's your entry point, because you know that doesn't fly in Palestine. It doesn't go over so well. So sometimes that might be a way to get an entry point in there. But I wouldn't start right away with the politics. I would start by showing them your humanity and getting to know, and ask them questions too. Say, well, this is about my family. Don't say where you live or anything. Obviously, but you could share some things about yourself and then hear some things about them, and then you get on this more comfortable level, and then bring in the politics. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you very much. In the beginning, in the introduction, we heard you say that you are, or Tammi, that you also talk to governments. And I'm just wondering if you've had the opportunity here, and if so, have they heard you say that it's a short step to violence, and what their response is?
I've had a meeting with the premier of Victoria's Multicultural Affairs. I'm probably saying the wrong, but I did have a Zoom meeting the day before I left. I had a Zoom meeting with them, and I said that I would be available and that I'd be here if they wanted to continue the conversation. They said that they were interested, but I haven't heard yet. But I've only been here a week, so but we'll see. We'll see how that goes. But I think there is some interest from the government here, but I'm being hopeful. I'm being hopeful. But I have reached out. I did send I sent an email to the Prime Minister and also the Premier's office here in Victoria. And I did get a response back from the Premier's office through the Multicultural Affairs. I'm probably saying the wrong office, but right. I'm trying though. I'm trying. I think that's all we can do is we can try. And if these politicians don't want to hear our voices, then they need to be replaced in the next election.
Yeah, hi. I'm just wondering how many, or what's your sense of, what's your feeling about the percentage or the groups that can't be undone, brought back unradicalized? I mean, in your case, you had within you, the way I read it, there was some goodness from your youth and so on, and so there was a reference point, But some of these kids, they know nothing else. It's right through. And I'm also thinking of the Hamas case, where it's been from day one, and there's no other reference point. There's nothing in them to refer back to. And yet, on the other hand, there are some Hamas people that have come back. But if I've looked into their stories, and it's because they had a terrible time in Hamas, so they wanted to get out. But so I'm just wondering, it's a very interesting thing to play with, because some are irredeemable. Would you agree with that?
Ooh. I mean, I think there's some people that can never be reached, but there's others that I would have never thought I would have left the movement. And I know other people I've known, I've in the work that I do now with de-radicalizing, I don't just de-radicalize far right, but also far left people from, extremists on the left, the communist, Antifa types. I've also helped people out of groups like Hamas and jihadis. I've met some former jihadis, jihadi propagandists even, believe it or not. And I've found that extremism is the same. The way they hold people in place, and I didn't know this when I first left the movement. I thought I could only help people leave the far right because it was so unique. That's what I thought. And then after meeting all these other people, you realize, holy cow, our stories are so similar. The way that they hold people in place is so similar. And there's been people that I've helped out that were involved even 20 or so years longer than me. So I think the possibility of reaching people is great. I don't think we can reach everybody, but I think we can try. We can set that goal and we can try to reach people. You have I can't remember his name right off the top of my head, but he was the son of one of the leaders of Hamas, and he speaks out. So that's a really, what's his name?
Mossab Hussein Youssef.
Mossab Hussein Youssef, yes. So he's a perfect example of somebody that came from a really dark place and turned his life around. So I don't know if I think that there's people that are not redeemable. I think maybe if you're a psychopath or a sociopath, that's kind of hard to come back from. But most other people, I think we have that deep intrinsic desire to want to do good, and if we can show people that it's wrong, that there's a possibility of change.
Can I perhaps follow up on that? Thank you. And thank you for tonight. It's been absolutely astounding. It really has been, so thank you. I'm very grateful. But following from what you've said, one of the fundamental differences that I see between the pro-Pal demonstrators and the neo-Nazis is that the pro-Pal demonstrators claim to be based in humanity and causes of humanity. I understood what you said was it was reaching that core of humanity that enabled you to de-radicalise and to come out. They just don't see the Jews are part of humanity. So how do you bring those two together?
I would say with the left especially, they use that language, and they use that language with intention, to say that they're all about humanity. They're standing up against fascism, they're standing up against hate, but what are they doing? That's intolerance. That is fascism. They are what they hate. It's like you go so far to one side, you become the other, or they say, well, so-and-so went so far left, they got their guns back, I mean, that's something we say in the U.S., as far as the far right is pro-gun, the far left is always say, no, we're against gun. But if you go so far to the left, then you get your guns back. They become that radical. So I think that language is definitely problematic because they believe that they're out there serving humanity and they're out there against racism and against hate. But what are they doing? They're perpetuating it because they're saying death to the IDF and from the river to the sea. What does that mean? We know what that means. But do all of those students that are on those campuses, do they understand that? They understand they're really calling for the genocide of the Jewish people by saying that. Do they get that? That's what I think we need to get through. We have to get that through to them because that's dangerous, and that's where the intersections of hate come into play. Is that it's different ideologies, but they're saying the same hateful things in the end.
It seems that last year the government was banning swastikas and Heil Hitler, and now they're just doing nothing. I'm really cross with the government. I think if they stepped in, they would have nipped this in the bud a long time ago. It wouldn't have grown as it is. I've got a friend who goes to all these rallies, and he says about 3/4 of them have nothing better to do on a Sunday afternoon but go and walk, And I think the government's got a lot to answer for. And as for the campuses, they should have gone there straight away and said at the time how many of you were enrolled there, because people we heard were being paid to go. And if you're not enrolled, get out of here, and the rest of you get back to class. But it seems that they're just putting a blind eye to everything now.
I agree with you, but do you have a question on that as well?
I did make a statement, sorry. You said not to know. What can we do? Because we had an election, we had a chance to get rid of the government, but it seems the other side is stronger than us in numbers. And unless they all wake up one day and get a reality check, it's not going to happen purely by numbers.
We got to elect better people that are going to do more. I think that's really the answer.
I think a couple more questions.
Thank you, Bill, for tonight. You say spend your time educating and everything. Do you try and educate people in your in the movement now, like ex-neo-Nazis or neo-Nazis right now? You try and get involved and recruit them and say, hey, what you're doing is wrong, and
like outreach to the movement groups type of thing. It doesn't really work that way. We do some counter messaging stuff. We've done things like we put out YouTube videos and do counter messaging, but like approaching them, going right to them and going, hey man, you're wrong. It doesn't usually work. We want them, now if they come and ask questions, and I've had a lot of people who come and say, well, are you a communist now, or this or that, and they start asking questions, and being able to have those conversations where you tell somebody, hey, you can leave the movement, you can still be on the right, you can be on the left, you can be wherever you want, just don't hate people and don't be way out here on the fringes. And you would think that you just gave them some grand epiphany that they, that's some complex answer, which is so simple. But they don't think of it like that because in their minds, everything's extreme, everything's right, far left, they don't see the gray areas, there's no gray areas, it's one extreme or another. So in that sense, talking to them and having those conversations there, when they're willing to talk, when they're willing to ask questions, as long as they're not coming straight out threatening, then I don't typically engage with them. But if they say just something offensive or stupid or whatever, or they're just asking questions, I always engage because I feel like that's where we could be seed planters like Johnny Appleseed and plant seeds that can eventually take root and change hearts and minds. So it's not like some of the organizations talk about, well, we can do an intervention. Sometimes we do that with like young kids, a family will do that, and sometimes that works, but like usually with adults, it's really difficult and you can't approach it in that way. So we hold it like for conversations and on a one-on-one basis, which takes a lot of time and a lot of effort, and you don't see results typically snap of fingers. So some people you do, but it's usually a process.
Hi, so I don't know. Thank you for coming to talk here, by the way. My question has to do with at the start of, I guess, this conflict and this cycle, we heard a lot about the idea of this very vocal minority and this sort of silent majority. And I guess maybe many of us took comfort in the idea that people had our backs. And then we had this election, and I think the election sort of showed that maybe there's not, like, the numbers don't necessarily speak for themselves in the same way that we perhaps thought they did. So my question to you is, do you think that there's this idea of silent majority? And if there is, how do you vocalize the majority to combat hate with love?
Wow, that is a really good question. Radical kindness and I think just the faith of the Jewish people, the idea of teshuvah, these are things like when I was in the movement, when I was an anti-Semite, and like a lot of these people are, they don't see that. They believe in the propaganda, the false narratives that are being supplanted. A lot of times I explain this to young people, the kids in the school. I say, you guys remember Opposite Day where you wore your clothes backwards? That was my life. So that's the way a lot of these people think, is what they know about your faith and is wrong, is twisted. So a lot of times if you can show them that, explain the faith, and I'm not saying it's like the job of every single person to do that, because some of us just don't have that capacity or that desire or that willingness to want to do that. But if you can dig down and do that and engage with these people, you can one at a time change those hearts and minds and use processes like relational dialogue to reach them and show them your humanity. Because it's really hard to hate somebody you don't know, and that's something I didn't get a chance to touch on in my talk. That's how Daryl Davis reached me. He told me about how racism and hate affected him as a child and what that did to him. And it didn't feel right. It didn't settle right. So if you're talking with somebody that is out there that's dehumanizing Jewish people or anybody else for that matter, and you show them your humanity and they can see that and see how that it takes a level of vulnerability, which is tough. But if you can do that and bring them to that level, unless they're a sociopath or a psychopath, we all have that inside of us. And you might not see it, but you'll probably see the flicker in the eyes or something. You'll probably notice that if you share that and they're really truly listening, and that's the sweet spot for change right there, is when they see that humanity. Because it's really hard to demonize or hate somebody that's not done something to you. If you could say, a lot of times there was people that came into the movement that had like a bad experience with a minority, like their brother was shot by a black man or something like that. So it's, well, I hate all black people. And I'll deal with this in the disengagement process with people. There's one individual I can think of right off the top of my head. He'd been out for 10 years, and he says, I'm still struggling with black people. And I said, what is it about black people? What do you think you're struggling with? And he says, you know, there's this black guy down the street, and my wife walks to work every day. He knows we're married, and he hits on her every single day when she's walking to work. And I said, okay. I said, is there anything else about black people that you can think of? And he goes, no, that's really the main thing I can think of. And I says, well, would it be okay if a white guy was hitting on your wife when she was walking to work? And he's like, no. You know, so are you sure? Are you sure? You know, he's like, yes, I'm sure. Of course that's not okay. And I said, do you really think this is a black issue, or maybe this guy's just a jerk? You know, maybe this guy's got the problem. It's not anything to do with him being the color of his skin, it's his behavior. And it was like a light switch turned on. So sometimes it's just framing things in a different manner that can show people that, and they can realize, look, it's not that. Or I'll say things like, you know, if they try to say, well, all Jews do this, all blacks do this, all Hispanics do this, they say, okay, so this white guy over here is a serial killer. Are you a serial killer? No. Are all white people serial killers? No. Well, then why are you putting all these other groups of people in a box? Why are you labeling them? So sometimes it's just that perspective, and that causes a light switch to flip on.
Jeff, Tammi, thanks so much. That was a really meaningful and special conversation. For the past 2 years, there's been this kind of dark cloud that has been hanging over our community's heads, and I think today it felt like the cloud was hovering lower than usual. Certainly the scenes we saw in our city were scenes that where it felt we were at the intersection of hate from all angles, and tonight's conversation in a sense was a bit of a flame, a small ray of light that penetrated through the darkness, and that was really helpful. And Jeff, I'm wondering, when you were going through those dark times, what is it that carried you through, and what is it that gives you now reasons for optimism to continue with your work? What is it that keeps you hopeful about the future, given that it feels like between the algorithms we spoke of, the echo chambers, the impunity with which we're seeing extremism flood our streets, there is a lot to be concerned about, and yet I know that you're inherently optimistic, otherwise you wouldn't be doing the work you're doing. So what is it that keeps you going, and what keeps you hopeful?
It's a really good question. Doing what's right, I think, is the most important thing, and being able to rise above that. If you let evil take hold and you let that win and you surrender to that, then you're part of the problem too, is the way I see it. Not you personally, I'm saying, but the people that allow that to take place. If you just allow that to roll over you and say, you know what, I can't do anything, being a defeatist, giving up and saying, you know, there's no hope, I just have to just let this happen and just accept that it's this way. I don't think anybody should do that. The moment we do that, we lose. That's how we go backwards. So keep fighting forward no matter what. It doesn't even matter if you're outnumbered, if you're, you know, it does not matter. You just have to keep doing what's right and knowing that. And if you have the power of God and the power of willpower and everything else behind you, and you know that what you're doing is right, you can't go wrong. You can't fail. Ultimately, that has to overcome. Light always triumphs over the darkness. So I think it's a lot of it is a mindset. It was difficult for me, especially early on, you know, going through that struggle and then beating yourself up over all the mistakes from the past and things like that. But I guess you could say I spent 27 years in a really dark place, and I didn't give up on that until I realized that I was wrong. Now that, it's about being tenacious too, you know, just not being willing to quit, always getting back up. If you get knocked down, you get back up. Just like a boxer in a fight, you know, you just keep going, you keep going, you keep going. And I think that's an important message that we all need to carry forward, is not to let evil take hold of, not of us, not of the world, not of those around us. We have to just keep fighting forward. It doesn't matter if we're outnumbered or...
Thank you again, ladies and gentlemen. And just before we conclude, Jeff's books are over there, American Nazi From Hate to Humanity. It's not an easy read, believe me, but it's a searing, compelling one. And it's really an incredible story of redemption. But I think what is so poignant about Jeff's story is it's not just about redemption. We know redemption stories. This is about someone who's actively trying to undo the damage. So we're just delighted that you came. Thank you so much. It's been incredible. He's more than happy to sign copies, engage, talk to him, ask him any questions you like, and thank you again for coming out on a cold Melbourne night.